Well, today we'll be continuing, of course, where we've been in Matthew's Gospel. We've been in section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, according to my outline. And this section describes the events of Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. So we are here now then in the final week of the ministry of Jesus on the earth. I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And that certainly goes for the Jerusalem authorities there, who have been very much opposed to Jesus. But of course their opposition has had implications for the people and their overall response to Jesus as well. So really his final visit to Jerusalem does have a very strong tone of condemnation against all of them. And as of now, I'm teaching through this fifth and final portion of section 6, as I've been doing for a good long while now. And this, of course, is the Olivet Discourse. This is Matthew 24 and 25. This is a private sermon from Jesus to his disciples, is what's happening here in the Olivet Discourse. And in this portion, Jesus predicts and describes the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. And these are the things we've been studying for a few months now as I've been teaching through Matthew. And so far we've made it now through the first 21 verses of the Olivet Discourse, which are the first 4 passages according to the outline that I gave you some time ago as I've broken down the Olivet Discourse, or at least the first part of it, into several passages. So we've made it through the first 4 of those, which you would think maybe we've made some greater time by now, but we've taken it very slowly through some of these things, of course. So far, we've studied the questions of the disciples which they raised with Jesus after he said that the temple in Jerusalem was going to be leveled. They immediately had several questions for him, and in answering their questions, that's how we get the Olivet Discourse. So it's all about answering those questions. And then we've studied what Jesus calls the beginning of birth pangs, which I have said are the normal recurring dangers plaguing the world between the first coming of Christ and his second coming. So when he talks about all those wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes and all these kinds of things, that's just really the normal pattern of history over and over again until his return. We've also studied the tribulation of the church. And by that, I don't really mean any specific period of years of tribulation for the church. I really just mean the same sort of thing. Everything that the church is going to experience between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. So basically, we, in addition to all the birth pangs, also have all kinds of problems, both from within the church, but also from outside of the church, in things like persecution and false teachers and the effect that those things have on us. Jesus does say, however, in that same passage, that we will also have something to look forward to. He says that the gospel will be preached to all nations of the world, so meaning that we are eventually going to triumph over all those difficulties, and that those who endure to the end will be saved, as he says. So that's what we have to look forward to. There's tribulation, yes, but also triumph. And then finally, we have studied the Great Tribulation of Judea, which probably took up the most amount of time in all that we've been saying. And I've made the argument that Christ was talking about the horrible suffering of the Jews during their great revolt against the Roman Empire, which started in about the year 66 and went into about the year 73, with Jerusalem being entirely destroyed in the year 70, right there in the middle. And that Great Tribulation, of course, I think is what Christ has in mind that whole time there of that warfare. That is the Great Tribulation of Judea, as I think Christ has been describing here in the Olivet Discourse lately. So that is the ground we have covered so far. Now, very soon, we're going to push forward into the next passage of the Olivet Discourse. We're finally going to move forward into new things. However, my sermon for today needs to kind of slow that process for a little bit. I want to provide one final look at the passages we've already studied so far. So the past 4 passages, the prior 21 verses, those things I want to review again in a sense here. Now, what has really happened is that while teaching through these 21 verses, I have discovered several Old Testament passages which seem relevant to what Christ has been teaching. And I've had these on my mind almost from the very beginning. And specifically, I think Jesus also had them in his mind, honestly, is what I think is going on here as we go through these passages. I think Christ has had these passages on his mind as well. And I've been meaning, therefore, all this time to actually make mention of these passages and show the connection. The thing is, as I've been writing out my sermons, I've been unable to find a good place for these observations in all this time. So, that being the case, I want to do one more sermon in which I finally give these passages the attention I think they deserve. So to that end, my title for today's sermon is Loose Ends, because that's exactly what we're dealing with today. We're tying down loose ends from all these prior sermons that I've had and these past 21 verses. This is going to be a fairly short sermon, probably about half the normal length, really. But I do want to talk about these in as much detail as I think is necessary. So I have 4 headings for you, and of course each of those headings is dedicated to one of these Old Testament passages that I think Christ had in mind as he was giving these teachings here. So based on the first of these passages, Christ seems to imply the apostasy of Israel, which I will define what I mean by apostasy when I get there. Secondly, the second passage focuses on the birth pangs, but also on the salvation brought to the world at the same time. There's an Old Testament passage that is kind of like that. And then my third passage shows us that Christ implies a cruel invasion to follow these birth pangs. And of course, as we read in the Olivet Discourse, that's not really a surprise, but I think there's an Old Testament passage kind of standing behind what Christ says. And then finally, the last of these passages, I want to show you how Christ implies that Israel is about to go into exile again, having no king, which again is not entirely surprising given the Olivet Discourse itself, but again, an Old Testament passage I think Christ has in mind as he talks about these things. So that is what we're doing today. In a lot of ways, this is kind of a riskier message because I'm trying to read the mind of Jesus like 2,000 years after he preached this particular sermon. And that is always kind of a bit of a guessing game. But at the same time, I think if we compare the Olivet Discourse to these Old Testament passages I have in mind, it seems pretty hard to deny a connection for at least most of them. And I'm sure in some of all of this, there is something that was actually there in the mind of Jesus. I'd be really surprised if none of it were. So I just want to show you these things and leave them for your consideration and also give you a little bit of background into the thoughts of Jesus as he was preaching the Olivet Discourse. So we'll start with the first passage. And in this passage, I said Christ seems to imply the apostasy of Israel. Now, by apostasy, what I mean by that word, that is how we describe basically religious people turning to sin, turning away from their faith and practices. So, of course, thinking about Christians, we're talking about among Christians, it would be Christians turning away. Thinking of Jews, it would be Jews in some sense turning away from what God wants them to believe and do. All of that is apostasy. So that's what the word means. So given the entire flavor of the ministry of Christ, you know that Christ considered most of the people around him to be apostate in some way. A lot of his words throughout the entirety of his ministry have been, in some sense, calling out wrongdoing, opposing wrong beliefs, wrong practices, trying to lead people into the right way and a better way. So definitely, dealing with apostasy is one of the chief things Christ has been doing all this time. What you may not realize is that Jesus implies this apostasy even while describing the birth pangs here in Matthew 24. So let's read that passage again. Matthew 24, verses 4 through 8. Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So all of that there, those are the birth pangs. And of course you see some, there's like, well, there are false prophets mentioned, people coming in Jesus' name. That's kind of like an apostasy. But I really mean something even a little deeper than that. And those people familiar with the Old Testament may make a connection here. So I want to read a passage. This is 2 Chronicles, and it's from chapter 15. Now this passage describes an event from the reign of King Asa of Judah. So that is the rough context for this. And I want to go ahead and read what that passage says. There we are. So this is 2 Chronicles 15, verses 1 through 7. And the chief thing for you to be listening for here, listen to the wording of some of these descriptions and ask yourself if they sound familiar to you in some way. So 2 Chronicles 15, starting in verse 1. Now the Spirit of God came on Azariah the son of Oded, and he went out to meet Asa and said to him, Listen to me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you when you are with him. And if you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. For many days Israel was without the true God, and without a teaching priest, and without law. But in their distress they turned to the Lord God of Israel, and they sought him, and he let them find him. In those times there was no peace to him who went out, or with him who came in, for many disturbances afflicted all the inhabitants of the lands. Nation was crushed by nation, and city by city, for God troubled them with every kind of distress. But you be strong and do not lose courage, for there is reward for your work. Now, in that prophecy from this guy Azariah to King Asa, there's some wording there that sounds a little bit familiar to you if you've been thinking about the Olivet Discourse as of late. Specifically verses 5 through 6 here sounds a lot like what Jesus describes in this passage about these birth pangs that he mentions in the kind of the first big portion of the Olivet Discourse. Especially similar is the description of nation rising against nation and cities against city here, right? That sounds very familiar to what we see Jesus describe over in the Olivet Discourse, although he talks about nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So the wording is a little different, but the formula is very much the same, and some of the wording is very much similar. Now, the thing to remember about all this is not just a similarity with the description of these birth pangs, it's what Azariah here says is happening at that time. So as all these distresses are coming upon these different lands and nations, at the same time, Israel was without God, without law, and without a teaching priest. Right? So basically apostasy, the nation has turned away from God at that point as all these distresses are afflicting the nations of the world. And all of this, of course, is in an exhortation from this prophet to actually seek God so you can find him and to not risk God himself turning away from you. So again, in the process of exhorting them against apostasy, he describes the apostasy that Israel has recently been engaging in, and also all these distresses afflicting nations and cities, not just in Israel. It's kind of a strange thing for the prophet to say here, but he does say it. And the similarity between this and what Jesus describes makes me wonder if he has this passage in mind as he's describing those birth pangs, and if he again has in mind the overall apostasy of Israel. So here's Israel about to turn away from their Messiah in the fullest sense. They're going to crucify him, and at the same time there's going to be all these different distresses and calamities throughout the nations of the world after they do that. Sounds like a pretty strong connection to me, and I've wanted to mention this for a while, but here and now I'm finally getting around to it. So there's the first passage that I think Christ might have in mind as he himself is delivering the Olivet Discourse. My second passage likewise focuses on these birth pangs, but also on the salvation to be brought to the world at the same time as these birth pangs. Now again, this goes back to what we've already studied in the Olivet Discourse. We've seen this, Jesus moves forward in the Olivet Discourse from talking about the birth pangs to talking about the tribulation of the church, but also the result of the church's perseverance, which is taking the gospel to all nations. And again, we'll read that passage. This picks up where we left off in the Olivet Discourse. So starting in Matthew 24, verse 9, reading through verse 14, he says, "Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you'll all be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, the love of the many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." So the idea here overall, as we kind of follow this flow of things, we've got all these birth pangs and all these calamities and things, but through all of that, the gospel is spreading, and the church is enduring, and eventually the gospel will reach the point where all nations have heard the gospel and have that testimony. So we have this kind of transition from these birth pangs, onward into salvation, worldwide salvation even, the gospel of Jesus going everywhere. And this seems again somewhat similar to another Old Testament passage that I wanted to read for you. This is from Isaiah. This is Isaiah 42, and this is one of the servant songs. And for those of you that have maybe the older group of kids, I know we talked about Isaiah at some point, but also any of you who know this, the servant songs are these passages that show up kind of toward the end of Isaiah's book. They're all basically about the Messiah in some way. So these are very much on topic for talking about the teachings of Jesus. But Isaiah 42 specifically has a passage that I think is somewhat familiar to what we've just seen in the Olivet Discourse. So Isaiah 42, starting in verse 10, we'll read through verse 16 and see if you can spot a similar flow of events here. So 42, verse 10 says, "Sing to the Lord a new song, sing his praise from the end of the earth. You who go down to the sea and all that is in it, you islands and those who dwell on them. Let the wilderness and its cities lift up their voices, the settlements where Kedar inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing aloud. Let them shout for joy from the tops of the mountains. Let them give glory to the Lord and declare his praise in the coastlands. The Lord will go forth like a warrior. He will arouse his zeal like a man of war. He will utter a shout. Yes, he will raise a war cry. He will prevail against his enemies. I have kept silent for a long time. I have kept still and restrained myself. Now, like a woman in labor, I will groan. I will both gasp and pant. I will lay waste mountains and hills and wither all their vegetation. I will make the rivers into coastlands and dry up the ponds. I will lead the blind by a way they do not know. In paths they do not know, I will guide them. I will make darkness into light before them, and rugged places into plains. These are the things I will do, and I will not leave them undone." So here we've got a passage that begins very much, and I didn't read the entire servant song, by the way. I kind of jumped into the middle of it just to get the portion that I think is really relevant. But here in this portion of Isaiah 42, we see this kind of description of worldwide salvation, where the entire world is being called upon to praise God for what he's about to do. And then he kind of backs up, and God himself, speaking in first person, describes how it's going to be. He talks about having pains like a woman in labor, birth pains, like we've been talking about from the Olivet Discourse. And the result of that is all this calamity stuff, like mountains getting leveled and all this kind of thing. But also through that, leading the blind and giving light in the place of darkness, which again is meant for the entire world as the passage begins. So you have this whole thing where these birth pangs, from God this time, create all these disturbances in the world, but the end result is actually worldwide salvation and light in the darkness. It's a very similar flow to what we see in the Olivet Discourse, and I can't help but wonder yet again if it has informed Jesus' way of talking about these things and these birth pangs, and moving then from there into the eventual worldwide victory of the gospel. as it goes throughout the nations of the world. So there also, I think there might be a connection worthy of mention. All right, third passage. Again, like I said, we're moving quickly. We're already halfway done here. This one, again, kind of centers on these birth pangs, but at the same time implies that there is a cruel invasion to follow these birth pangs. And again, this is kind of on the level of implication, but I do think it might be there in the mind of Jesus as he talks about these things. Now, in the Olivet Discourse, as we keep moving on, we eventually get to the Great Tribulation of Judea. And this, of course, is Matthew 24, starting in verses 15, going through verse 21. It says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." And again, of course, I think that is describing this time of the great Jewish revolt, which of course did feature an invasion from the Romans when they came in to retake the land of Judea for themselves. Now in the timeline, the overall timeline given by Jesus, he starts off talking about these birth pangs, and then follows that with the tribulation of the church, then gets to the tribulation, the great tribulation of Judea, as I've said. So that's kind of the time frame here. We've got birth pangs starting, and then while all that's happening, we eventually get to all this terrible stuff that happens among the Jews there in and around Jerusalem. Now, this chain of events again brings to mind another scripture. This is also a passage from Isaiah. And I do want to read this one to you. This is Isaiah 19. Now, this passage is actually from something Isaiah says about the nation of Egypt, which might seem a little bit off topic, because after all, this is Egypt we're talking about, and not anything happening in Israel necessarily. But I think when you read it, you'll see the connection that I have in mind. So let's go ahead and see this. So this is Isaiah 19, and we'll go ahead and start verse 1. Might as well start at verse 1. We'll read through verse 4, just here at the very beginning of Isaiah 19. So the oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. So I will incite Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will each fight against his brother and each against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Then the spirit of the Egyptians will be demoralized within them, and I will confound their strategy, so that they will resort to idols and ghosts of the dead, to mediums and spiritists. Moreover, I will deliver the Egyptians into the hand of a cruel master, and a mighty king will rule over them, declares the Lord of hosts. So there you see at least the first part that I've read here, God's plan to deal with Egypt in the days of Isaiah and the prophecy Isaiah made against them. And this ends, of course, with this cruel master to rule over them, this king. Now, if you keep reading all that Isaiah has to say about the nation of Egypt, and this goes into chapter 20 as well, so you have to keep reading for quite some way, you'll see exactly who this cruel master is. This is the time when Assyria was kind of the big empire in that part of the world, and we're gradually just kind of taking over everything. And Assyria is the nation that God has in mind to bring in here to really punish Egypt, and they're going to be the cruel master to take over there. So it's very much an invasion that he has in mind there. But before any of that happens, Isaiah says, again, we've got this scenario that, again, should sound very familiar. You've got city fighting against city and kingdom against kingdom, which is kind of the other half of that description that we didn't get from 2 Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles, we had nation against nation. Now we have kingdom against kingdom. And that phrase finds its way into the Olivet Discourse as Jesus describes these things. So when Christ asserts that conflicts of nations and kingdoms will give way to the worst of all tribulations in Judea, He's really calling to mind an earlier chain of events. God has done this sort of thing before. This time, in the prior time that is, he did it to Egypt. You had this kind of disturbance there, kind of taking on multiple cities, multiple kingdoms, ending with Assyria coming into Egypt and just taking over and being a cruel master over them. Much like these birth pangs described by Jesus, give way to this worser tribulation where the Romans come in and just pulverize Judea there for a period of a few years. So history repeats itself, basically. And God has done this kind of thing before. And again, seems to me likely that Christ has something like that in mind as he is delivering his own predictions there for what's going to happen in the Olivet Discourse. What God did in and around Egypt, he's going to do in and around Judea this time. So that is the third passage I had in mind, which I thought was worthy of some mention here. We now come to the last one. And this one I said that Christ implies Israel is about to go into exile again with no king. And I said that I would describe what I meant by exile. So exile is basically when you are forced out of your homeland and cannot return. And that could be against a person, like one person gets exiled, maybe he committed some kind of crime, and his city said, get out of here and never come back. That kind of thing is exile. But more often we mean, like a kind of a national level thing. And in the Bible, we're certainly talking about the Jews being exiled out of their homeland, because the north kingdom of Israel was exiled by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom was eventually exiled by the Babylonians. They were taken out of their homeland and dispersed here and there, and were not allowed to return for quite some time. Now, exile may seem pretty unrelated to what we're dealing with in the Olivet Discourse, and to be fair, Matthew himself does not make any specific mention to anything that might be construed as exile. The thing is, Matthew's not the only version of the Olivet Discourse we have. And I do, of course, as I go through Matthew, I do refer to Mark and Luke and their version of the Olivet Discourse. And I figure why not, do as much as I can from those other ones. So I do want to read something to you from Luke's Gospel and Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse. And this does have something to do with exile, which I think is worthy of mention. So Luke 21, starting in verse 20, this is his description of the Great Tribulation of Judea. And he includes some things that Matthew does not. So here's what Luke writes. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to the people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be led captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now it's that last verse there, verse 24, where he really gets into some pretty exile-sounding language as he describes this thing. On the one hand, he says that the people are going to be led captive into all nations, which is what happened to Israel previously, several centuries before, and says that Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles for a while. Well, that is also what happened. Whether the Babylonians came in, took over the city, and took the Jewish people and sent them out to different places in their empire. So he's basically using an exilic description here to describe what's going to happen in this great tribulation of Judea. Now, again, we have another Old Testament passage that I think should be brought in here specifically. And once again, as has been true of as is true of 3 of the 4 of these passages, if I've been counting correctly, this connection to birth pangs. It's just it keeps coming up in the way these things are described. I want to read something to you from Micah chapter 4, which again kind of strings all these things together in a way that might also be in Jesus' mind as he talks about them. So Micah chapter 4, verses 9 through 10. So here is one of his descriptions here. Now, why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you? Or has your counselor perished, that agony has gripped you like a woman in childbirth? Writhe and labor to give birth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth. For now you will go out of the city, dwell in the field, and go to Babylon. And there you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. So here, Micah being one of these prophets kind of looking forward to the exile that is coming, he describes it as a situation kind of in two ways here. He describes it, first of all, as again using birth pangs, labor pains as of a woman going into labor here. So he describes that as being kind of like the mood and the emotion of the time, but also has this mention here, kind of this offhanded reference like, well, where's your king? Has your counselor perished? Is there no king among you? The whole idea among the Jews when they first wanted a king was they wanted a king to fight their battles for them. Well, where's their king now? I mean, why isn't somebody standing between them and these people that are coming to take them away into exile, into Babylon? That's kind of the situation here, kind of this almost a mocking prophecy that he gives to them as he describes these things. So what you have there in the flow of events is something very similar to what you have in the Olivet Discourse. The Jews are about to do away with their king. I mean, they're about to finally reject Christ by crucifying him. After that begins this period of birth pangs that's going to affect all the world around them. And then here comes this enemy. There's no king to deliver them. They rejected their king. They don't have any security such as Christians had. Christians were told to get out of there, and they were given some warning as to these things about to happen and to get out of there before everything got really bad in Judea. The rest of the nation doesn't have that. They're just kind of going along thinking they're going to win this rebellion, and that all goes terribly. And it ends with a lot of them being taken captive, and I talked about this somewhat in my prior messages, and I know I did in the special sermon that I posted online. This whole thing ended with them rounding up the remaining prisoners and kind of taking them on this victory tour through the nations, making them participate in gladiatorial games, sacrificing them in Rome to the temple of Jupiter and all this stuff. So yeah, definitely an exile of sorts that happened there to the Jewish survivors after the great Jewish revolt came to an end. Again, kind of a similar chain of events as we see in prophecy. Again, makes me wonder if Christ had some of this in mind as he was talking about these things in the Olivet Discourse. And if anyone, knowing their Old Testament would make these connections as well. And those are really the things that I wanted to share with you. Again, there's not many of them. Like I said, these were things that I was trying to work into my prior sermons. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't find space for them. So here in this short message, just a list of some Old Testament passages that might be in the mind of Christ as we go through the Olivet Discourse, and which might be worthy of some mention alongside these things. And so I wanted to give them to you here today. So again, there was one passage that seemed to imply the apostasy of Israel. A second one, which connects the birth pangs to the salvation that would eventually come to the world after that time of birth pangs. And then the third one, implying a cruel invasion to follow these birth pangs. And then finally, this whole thing about lacking a king and going into exile also maybe factoring into the Olivet Discourse. So those are the final things that I had to say on the first 21 verses here of Matthew 24. And with that, we can now move on to something else. I know you've probably been kind of itching to move a little bit further forward, now that we've spent so much time in these first 21 verses, and especially the Great Tribulation of Judea. So next time we're going to move on to the next passage, which I have called the Tribulation of the Church Part 2, and I will describe why I named it that. So starting in verse 22, we will be moving on in the Olivet Discourse. And that's all I had for today. So if there are questions about any of that, I'll try to answer them. I guess questions on anything else from the first 21 verses are fair game, because we're not going back anymore. We're going forward in the rest of the Olivet Discourse. So if you have any questions or comments now is a good time for them.